Passengers shifted uncomfortably as the billionaire's autistic son screamed uncontrollably mid-flight, his cries echoing through the cramped cabin like a storm no one could calm. Flight attendants whispered, business travelers frowned, and even the father, hidden behind sunglasses, looked helpless. But then, from the very back row where the cheapest seats pressed knees against tray tables, a poor black girl stood up. With nothing to offer but her voice, her hands, and her heart, she walked forward and did the unthinkable, an act so pure, it would ripple far beyond that plane, rewriting the destiny of everyone on board. My beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, do me a quick favor, hit that like button. Why? Because each like tells YouTube, this story is worth sharing with more people who might really need it today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I do read every single one, and it makes me feel like we're sitting together in the same room, sharing these moments heart to heart. And don't forget to share this video with someone you love. You never know, the story you share might be the encouragement they've been praying for. Most importantly, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a story when it drops. This isn't just a channel, it's a family. And when you engage, you're helping us build a safe space where real stories bring real hope. The hum of the airplane engines was steady, but in the cramped rear rows, it only seemed to remind Amara of how far she was from the comfort she wished for. The air smelled faintly of recycled coffee and disinfectant, the kind of scent that clung to budget flights where the cheapest tickets sold out fast. Amara had snagged hers at the last minute with money she barely scraped together, money she should have saved for groceries or rent back home. At 8 years, Amara had already learned to stretch every dollar until it cried. Her mother, a housekeeper, worked double shifts to keep food on the table, while her younger brother struggled with asthma that often sent them rushing to free clinics. Amara herself worked odd jobs, babysitting, tutoring, sometimes bussing tables, while dreaming of one day becoming a teacher for children with special needs. But dreams, she knew, didn't pay bills. She leaned her head against the cool airplane window, her braided hair cushioning the glass, and thought about the week ahead. She wasn't traveling for vacation. She was flying to an interview for a scholarship program. It was her one shot at escaping the cycle of barely getting by. But even here, mid-air, she carried the weight of fear. What if she failed? What if she wasn't enough? A baby whimpered somewhere near the front, but Amara didn't stir. She had a natural patience with children, a gift her neighbors often noticed. She'd soothe their kids without effort, humming gentle tunes, making silly faces, or just listening when no one else had the time. Her kindness came as naturally as breathing, though it often went unnoticed in a world too busy to care about the poor girl from the South Side. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn spiral notebook. Inside were lesson plans she had designed herself, games for teaching letters, ideas for calming anxious kids, even drawings her little brother had colored on the margins. She smiled faintly at the scribbles. This notebook, as shabby as it was, carried her hope. Then, a sharp sound broke her thoughts. A sudden scream, high-pitched and raw, sliced through the cabin. Heads turned. Conversations hushed. The sound wasn't a baby's cry. It was older, heavier, filled with frustration and panic. The flight attendants rushed down the aisle, trying to calm the chaos. Amara sat up straight, her notebook slipping to the floor. Her eyes darted toward the sound. A boy, maybe 10 or 11, sat in first class, his body thrashing against the seatbelt. His face was red, streaked with tears, his hands beating against his legs in frantic rhythm. Passengers groaned and covered their ears. Beside him sat a man in a tailored suit, his expression concealed behind dark sunglasses. He whispered sharply to the boy, trying to grab his arms, but it only made things worse. The boy screamed louder, rocking violently, his cries bouncing off the cabin walls. Amara's heart clenched. She knew those cries. She had heard them before, at the community center where she volunteered, from children who couldn't find the words to explain their overwhelm. Children with autism. Children who weren't bad, but were simply drowning in sensations no one else could see. Her chest rose and fell as she looked around. The flight attendants fumbled, the passengers sighed in annoyance, and the suited man grew more rigid in his seat. No one seemed to understand. No one except her. And yet, she hesitated. Who was she to step forward? She was just a poor girl in the back of the plane. She didn't have a title, a degree, or the authority to intervene. What if she embarrassed herself? What if the man in the suit lashed out at her? Still, her hands trembled as she gripped the armrest. Something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was why she was here. The boy's cries rattled the air like a storm that wouldn't pass. His arms flailed, knocking a water cup to the floor, sending it rolling down the aisle. A businessman groaned and muttered something under his breath. A mother pulled her toddler closer, covering her child's ears. The flight attendants exchanged helpless glances, one of them trying to offer the man in the suit noise-canceling headphones for the boy, which he batted away in frustration. The man, clearly the boy's father, looked trapped. His jaw tightened, and though his sunglasses hid his eyes, the strain in his posture was impossible to miss. He whispered again, his voice low but urgent, "Daniel, please." "Please, son." His tone cracked, and for the first time, Amara saw past the expensive fabric and cool exterior. He wasn't just a billionaire in first class. He was a desperate father. Amara's heart raced. She thought about her little brother, how he'd sometimes panic when his inhaler was misplaced. She thought about the children at the community center who couldn't explain their feelings, who sometimes screamed not out of defiance but because their world had suddenly turned unbearable. She thought about all the times adults misjudged them, labeled them as problems, when what they needed most was understanding. Her seatbelt clicked open before she could second-guess herself. The aisle seemed longer than ever as she walked forward, rows of eyes following her. She could feel passengers silently judging. What is she doing? Who does she think she is? But her steps didn't falter. When she reached the front, the flight attendant stepped in her way, whispering sharply, "Miss, please return to your seat. We're handling this." Amara swallowed her fear, her voice soft but steady. "Please, just let me try. I think I can help him." The attendant hesitated, glancing at the father. The man's lips pressed into a thin line, his hand still gripping his son's arm as if afraid to let go. He finally looked up at Amara, his eyes, no longer hidden, bloodshot with exhaustion and desperation. "What do you know about this?" he asked, his voice rough, almost accusing. Amara's hands shook, but she met his gaze. "I know he's not trying to be difficult. He's overwhelmed. Please, just let me try." There was a pause, heavy and stretching. Then, as if surrendering, the man released his son's arm. The boy continued to rock violently, his cries tearing through the cabin. Amara knelt slowly in front of him, lowering herself to his level. She didn't reach out, didn't force contact. Instead, she began to hum. Softly at first, then a little louder, her voice carrying a tune she often used to calm her brother during his worst nights. The boy's rocking slowed, just slightly. His cries broke into hiccuping sobs. Amara's voice wove through the chaos, steady and patient, a sound that didn't demand but invited. She tapped her hand gently on her knee, creating a rhythm, predictable, soothing. After a minute that felt like forever, the boy's breathing shifted. His fists unclenched. His eyes, still wet with tears, flickered toward Amara. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, never breaking the rhythm of her song. Passengers leaned forward in stunned silence. The boy's screams quieted to soft whimpers, then to shaky breaths. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his forehead lightly against Amara's shoulder. She froze for a second, then gently wrapped her arms around him. Not tight, not overwhelming, just enough to let him know he was safe. The cabin was silent. The storm had passed. The father's lips parted, as though words had abandoned him. He blinked hard, his chest heaving once before he whispered, How did you?" Amara shook her head softly. Sometimes, all they need is someone to listen in the way they understand. And then she sat there on the floor of first class, holding a boy who wasn't hers, her cheap jeans brushing against expensive carpet, her heart breaking and healing all at once. The moment passed like a dream. Once Daniel had calmed, a flight attendant carefully helped Amara back to her seat, her knees sore from kneeling on the hard carpet. Passengers whispered, some offering faint nods of respect, but most quickly returned to their own concerns: laptops, magazines, restless naps. For them, it was a disruption solved. For Amara, it felt like a small miracle. The boy's father had murmured a strained thank you before turning his attention back to Daniel, who was now curled against him, clutching a small toy plane one of the attendants had retrieved. There was no applause, no dramatic recognition. Just quiet, almost awkward gratitude that faded quickly into the hum of the engines. Amara didn't mind. She hadn't stepped forward for thanks. She had only thought of the boy, the terror in his cries, the helplessness in his eyes. She knew what it was like to feel unheard, unseen, dismissed. If her song had offered him peace, even for a moment, that was enough. Back in her seat, Amara retrieved her notebook, though her hands shook too much to write. She replayed the scene in her mind, the hush that fell over the cabin, the boy's slow surrender to calm. She thought of her brother, of all the children she dreamed of teaching someday. "Maybe I really do have something to give," she whispered to herself. The plane landed hours later. While first-class passengers disembarked with their sleek carry-ons, Amara waited at the back, clutching her thrift store backpack. She caught one last glimpse of Daniel and his father, the man guiding his son gently down the jet bridge. For a moment, their eyes met. He looked at her, really looked, and nodded once. Not just gratitude, but recognition. Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd. Outside the airport, the heat clung to her skin as she boarded a shuttle to the cheap motel she'd booked. Her scholarship interview was in the morning, and she needed rest. But rest was hard to come by when bills were stacked back home and her mother's voice replayed in her head. "Amara, don't waste this chance. You're our hope." She stretched out on the stiff motel mattress, the springs creaking beneath her, and opened her notebook again. On the first page, in shaky handwriting, she wrote, "Kindness doesn't need permission." She underlined it twice. Unbeknownst to her, the man from first class hadn't forgotten. While Amara drifted into uneasy sleep, he sat in a quiet hotel suite across town, staring at his sleeping son. His mind replayed the moment, the girl from economy kneeling on the floor, her song calming storms he himself couldn't touch. And something inside him whispered, "Find her." The next morning, Amara stood in front of the scholarship panel with trembling hands. The interview room smelled faintly of coffee and ink, and the three professors seated across from her barely looked up from their papers as she introduced herself. She spoke about her passion for education, about wanting to work with children who often went unseen, unheard. Her voice shook at first, but then steadied when she spoke of her brother, of the children at the community center, of what she believed every child deserved: patience, dignity, and a chance. When she left the room, she felt a flicker of hope, but also the heavy weight of doubt. She didn't have the perfect resume, the polished references, the glowing letters of recommendation her wealthier competitors had. She had only her story, her heart, and the worn notebook in her bag. Would that be enough? What Amara didn't know was that she was already being watched. The man from First Class, Charles Donovan, billionaire investor, CEO of one of the largest private firms in the country, sat in a black car outside the university building. He had used his network to learn her name from the flight manifest and had quietly arranged to track her movements. Something about her refusal to stand by on the plane haunted him. Charles was not a man easily impressed. He had built his empire by being ruthless, discerning, and cautious. People often bent over backwards to please him, usually with ulterior motives. But the girl in economy? She had acted without hesitation, without seeking reward. That was rare. Almost unheard of. Still, Charles needed to know if what he saw was real or just a momentary spark. Over the following week, he had her shadowed, quietly, discreetly. A black SUV would appear parked across from the diner, where she waitressed to cover her rent. A man in a suit lingered near the community center, where she volunteered. She didn't notice. Her life was too consumed with survival to see she had become the subject of observation. And what they reported back stunned him. They told him of a young woman who gave her free meal to a homeless man outside the diner, even though she hadn't eaten all day. Of how she stayed late at the community center to clean up after the kids, long after the staff had left. Of how she tucked crumpled dollar bills into a donation jar marked asthma inhalers for kids when she thought no one was looking. Each report was another layer, another confirmation. She wasn't a fluke. Her kindness wasn't performance. It was who she was. Charles decided to test her himself. One evening, Amara was leaving the diner after a long shift, her feet aching, her apron stained. As she stepped into the cool night air, she found a man in shabby clothes sitting on the curb, shivering. He asked softly if she had spare change. She hesitated, her tips that night barely covered bus fare. But then she reached into her pocket and pressed a few crumpled bills into his hand, adding softly, "I hope this helps, even if it's not much." The man looked up, eyes sharp and assessing, before smiling faintly. She didn't know it, but the stranger was one of Charles's aides, testing her character up close. When Charles heard the result, something inside him solidified. This girl was different. And he wasn't done watching. Amara's life had never been easy. She grew up in a two-room apartment on the south side of the city, where the paint peeled from the walls and the neighbors' arguments carried through paper-thin ceilings. Her father had left when she was 8, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and a mother who worked herself ragged cleaning other people's houses. Amara had learned early to be the caretaker, cooking simple meals, walking her brother to school, helping him with homework when her mother's exhaustion left her falling asleep over laundry. Her brother's asthma attacks often kept her up through the night, counting his breaths, praying for the sound of relief when the inhaler finally worked. She became fiercely protective of him, unwilling to let the world dismiss him the way it dismissed her family. At school, she was the quiet girl with second-hand clothes, often overlooked or pitied. But teachers noticed something: her patience. When other students avoided kids who struggled, Amara stepped in. She stayed behind after class to help, never seeking credit. That spark of compassion grew into a calling she couldn't shake, even when her own life was falling apart. It was that history, the long nights, the overlooked kindness, that had shaped the girl who had sung on the airplane. Meanwhile, across the city, Charles Donovan was wrestling with his own hidden history. To the world, he was a billionaire, a titan of industry. But to those who knew him privately, he was a widower carrying wounds money could not heal. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him to raise Daniel alone. Daniel's diagnosis had come early, and while Charles could afford the best therapists, doctors, and schools, he could not buy patience. He could not buy the peace his son needed when the world overwhelmed him. And though he loved Daniel fiercely, he often felt powerless, ashamed that he, a man who could bend markets to his will, could not calm his own child's storms. That flight had been one of his lowest moments. The world had seen only a screaming boy and a frustrated man in a suit. But Amara had seen Daniel, not a spectacle, not a burden, but a child in pain. She had reached him in a way Charles never could. Her song had not just soothed Daniel. It had broken through Charles's own walls, forcing him to remember something he had buried. Not everything could be solved with money or power. Some problems required the one currency he had forgotten: kindness. And so the lives of a poor black girl from the South Side and a billionaire from a penthouse were quietly entwining, neither yet aware of how deeply their stories would change each other. Amara had just finished a late shift at the diner when a man in a crisp but understated suit walked in. He looked out of place among the worn booths and flickering neon lights, but he didn't order coffee or pie. Instead, he asked quietly for the manager, then requested that Amara herself serve him when she was free. She approached cautiously, tired from hours on her feet, her apron dotted with stains. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone polite but weary. The man smiled faintly. "Just tea. And conversation, if you don't mind." Amara blinked. Customers rarely wanted conversation, especially not with her. But something in his tone was sincere, not flirtatious or condescending. She poured him a cup of hot water, set down a tea bag, and slid into the booth across from him, apron still tied around her waist. The stranger introduced himself as Mr. Charles, nothing more. He didn't reveal his wealth, his company, or his status. He only asked about her life. At first, Amara hesitated. People didn't usually care about the poor girl from the South Side. But as the minutes stretched, she found herself talking about her scholarship hopes, about her brother, about her love for teaching. Charles listened, truly listened, without interruption. His gaze didn't drift to his phone or to the door. It stayed on her, steady and intent. He asked thoughtful questions, not prying but curious. "What keeps you going when things get hard?" he asked at one point. Amara smiled softly, though her eyes glistened. "Because I know what it feels like to be invisible. And I don't want any child to ever feel that way." The words struck Charles deeper than he expected. He thought of Daniel, so often misunderstood, and of how invisible his son's struggles seemed to the world outside their home. He realized Amara's compassion wasn't born of theory. It was carved from her own scars. Over the following weeks, Charles visited the diner more frequently. Sometimes he ordered food, sometimes only tea. Each time, their conversations stretched longer. Amara found herself looking forward to his presence, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. She never guessed he was the man from first class, nor that he was quietly pulling strings in the background, paying her motel bill anonymously, ensuring her scholarship application wasn't lost in bureaucracy. For Charles, Each meeting deepened his conviction. This young woman had something rare, something the world often overlooked. She was teaching him about patience, resilience, and a kind of strength money could never buy. And Daniel, too, had not forgotten. One night, Charles told him softly, "I met her again, the girl who helped you on the plane." Daniel's eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. "The singing girl," he whispered. Charles's chest ached. Yes, the singing girl. The girl who had reached them both. Their connection was growing. But life, as always, was about to test it. The cabin had fallen into a strange silence, punctuated only by the steady hum of the engines and the occasional sniffle from Nicholas, whose small body was still curled against Amara. For the first time in hours, peace had settled into the crowded plane. But with peace came another wave of tension. The billionaire, Mr. Whitmore, stood over them, torn between disbelief and something deeper. His eyes, usually cold and detached, softened as he watched his son's tiny fingers grip Amara's sleeve like an anchor in the storm. Nicholas's breathing slowed, his trembling eased, and for the first time in years, the boy closed his eyes without fear. Mr. Whitmore swallowed hard, struggling to process the scene before him. Why him? Why my son? His voice cracked, low enough that only Amara heard. Amara looked up, her own eyes glistening with exhaustion but burning with quiet conviction. Because he's not broken. He just needed someone to see him, not fix him. Someone willing to sit in the storm until it passed. Mr. Whitmore sank into the seat across from her, his expensive suit crumpling in ways it never had before. He removed his sunglasses, revealing bloodshot eyes that betrayed sleepless nights and silent battles. For years he had poured billions into therapies, gadgets, and caretakers, but none had reached his boy the way this poor girl from the back row had. "I've paid the best specialists," he admitted, voice trembling. "I've built entire programs. But nothing," he stopped, shaking his head. "Nothing has ever calmed him like this." Amara smiled softly, brushing Nicholas's hair from his forehead. "Sometimes money can't buy the thing a child needs most, connection. Love doesn't come with a price tag." Her words landed like a blow, but also like salvation. Mr. Whitmore's chest rose and fell unevenly, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. For a man who had conquered boardrooms and empires, admitting weakness felt impossible. Yet here he was, seeing the truth reflected in the gaze of a young woman who owned nothing but her humanity. As the plane cut through the clouds, Nicholas shifted, whispering a single word that cracked the billionaire's armor wide open. "Daddy." Mr. Whitmore froze. His son hadn't spoken to him directly in nearly 2 years. His throat tightened, and for a moment he could barely breathe. Slowly, he reached across the aisle, his hand trembling as it brushed his son's. Nicholas didn't pull away. He held on. Tears pooled in the billionaire's eyes, spilling over despite his desperate attempt to contain them. The passengers who had once glared at the disruption now watched in stunned silence, their own hearts unraveling. What had begun as an inconvenient flight had turned into something sacred, something unforgettable. Amara looked away, giving father and son their moment, even as her own heart twisted. She knew this connection wasn't hers to keep. She was only a bridge, a vessel carrying them toward healing. And when the flight landed, she would return to her life, unseen, uncelebrated, and likely forgotten. But that didn't matter. Because in this moment, she had given everything she had. And for the first time, the billionaire realized he had everything money couldn't buy, thanks to the sacrifice of a girl society would have dismissed without a second glance. The plane began its slow descent, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom to announce their approach. Seatbelts clicked into place, bags rustled in overhead bins, and the cabin filled with that restless energy that always accompanied landing. But row 32, once a storm of screams, remained a sanctuary of calm. Nicholas sat quietly, his small hand still gripping his father's, his head leaning against Amara's shoulder. It was as if all the walls that had separated him from the world had thinned, allowing warmth to seep through. Mr. Whitmore sat across from them, his usually perfect posture replaced by a humbled slump, his sharp features softened by awe. For years, he had hidden behind money, assuming that problems could be solved with a bigger check or a better expert. But watching Amara, a girl with no wealth, no power, no prestige, soothe his son with nothing but patience and love, stripped him of that illusion. When the plane touched down and rolled to a stop, the passengers who had once been irritated began to clap, not the polite applause reserved for landings, but a heartfelt, thunderous sound directed squarely at Amara. Some wiped tears, others simply smiled in quiet admiration. A woman in a business suit whispered, "She saved that boy." Amara blushed, unused to such attention. She had never been the center of anything except whispered pity or passing disregard. For once, though, she wasn't invisible. Mr. Whitmore turned to her, his voice steady now, filled with a gravity that made even the flight attendants pause. "You've given me more than any doctor, any program, or any dollar ever could. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Amara replied softly. "Just be there for him. See him the way he deserves to be seen." Her words were simple, but they struck him deeper than any boardroom speech or political negotiation ever had. He realized in that moment that transformation wasn't just happening in his son, it was happening in him. As the passengers began to disembark, Mr. Whitmore remained seated, refusing to let the moment fade. He studied Amara, noticing the wear on her shoes, the frayed edges of her backpack, the quiet strength in her eyes. She carried struggles he couldn't imagine, yet she had given herself so completely to his child. "Amara," he said at last, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it, "this isn't the end. I won't let it be." Nicholas tugged at her sleeve, his voice small but clear. "Stay." The single word made her heart ache. She smiled at him, brushing his cheek gently. "I can't stay forever, sweetheart. But I'll never forget you." Mr. Whitmore clenched his jaw, determination settling into his features. He had come onto that plane a billionaire, measured by assets and power. But he was leaving it a father transformed, because of a poor black girl who had dared to step forward when no one else would. And though Amara believed she would simply return to her quiet, struggling life, fate had other plans. Because the billionaire wasn't done with her. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos, families rushing toward baggage claim, flight crews wheeling carts, and tired travelers pushing through the crowd. Amara slung her worn backpack over one shoulder, preparing to slip quietly into the anonymity of the city beyond. She had done her part. The boy was safe. That was enough. But before she could disappear, a hand caught her arm. She turned to see Mr. Whitmore standing there, Nicholas by his side, clutching his father's hand but glancing hopefully at her. "Amara," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice firm yet almost pleading. "You don't walk away like this. Not after what you've done." She gave him a faint smile, trying to ease the tension. "I didn't do it for recognition. I just wanted to help." "I know," he said. "And that's exactly why I can't let this end here." He pulled a sleek business card from his wallet, but then paused, shaking his head as though realizing it wasn't enough. He tucked it away and met her eyes instead. No card, no contracts, no empty promises. I want to offer you something real. A place in Nicholas's life. A chance to help me build something better for kids like him. Something bigger than either of us. Amara blinked, stunned. Me? But I don't have qualifications. I'm not a therapist or a teacher. I'm just the only person who's reached him, Mr. Whitmore interrupted gently. The only one who saw him as more than a problem to fix. Nicholas tugged her sleeve again, whispering shyly, "Please stay." Her heart cracked open. She had spent her life overlooked, surviving on scraps, convinced she had little to give the world. Yet here she stood, being asked to help shape the life of a boy who had everything money could buy, except what she carried inside. Tears stung her eyes as she nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll stay." The billionaire's shoulders dropped in visible relief, a genuine smile breaking across his face, something no stock market victory had ever brought him. Then it settled. From this day forward, you're not just a stranger who helped mid-flight. You're family. Gasps rippled through nearby passengers who recognized the billionaire. Cameras clicked, whispers rose. But for Amara, none of that mattered. What mattered was the boy at her side, whose small hand slipped confidently into hers as though it had belonged there all along. As they walked out of the terminal together, billionaire, son, and the poor girl who had changed everything, the world outside carried on, unaware that history had shifted inside that airport. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary transformations don't begin in boardrooms or mansions. They begin in the heart of a poor black girl who dared to do the unthinkable. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If this touched your heart, then you're going to love the next one. It's just as powerful, and even more intriguing than you can imagine. So don't stop here. Check out more videos on my channel and continue the journey. I'll be waiting for you on the other side of that story. See you there.